Today is the 9th day of February in 2024, and we welcome you to our Chapter 49 podcast. My name is Larry Lannan, a volunteer, and I am a retiree. I help out Chapter 49 with some communications issues, including this podcast as one of my major endeavors. We thank you for spending some time with us today. We appreciate the fact that you've chosen to join us. If you feel this is a podcast that gives you something of value, feel free to let other people know, share the link, do whatever you think you might want to do to let other people know about it. But we appreciate the fact that you are with us. Chapter 49 represents most IRS employees in the state of Indiana, and the Chapter 49 president is Duncan Giles. Welcome back, Duncan.
Thanks, Larry. It's always good to be here.
So we are endeavoring to do this podcast just a couple of days before the Super Bowl. Now, we know that some people listen or watch all kinds of different days and times. So some people may watch or listen before the Super Bowl, some may be after. So you may already know who won or how the game went. But what I find interesting is that you go back to 1967, the very first Super Bowl, it didn't even sell out. The players and coaches didn't even want to play the game because the NFL and AFL had just combined and they were barely one entity at that point. They they really hadn't combined the way they did it later on, and now it has morphed into this American thing where it has the biggest TV audience of the year every year. It's really amazing. And the other thing about it, Duncan, is that they're playing the game in Las Vegas. Now, who would have ever thought, number one, there would be a NFL franchise in Las Vegas, and number two, I remember on the NFL Today years ago, they actually did hire somebody to be on the show called Jimmy the Greek. That Jimmy was known as an odds maker, but they wouldn't let him give point spreads. So when he would predict how a game would go, he couldn't say it's a 3-point favorite. He'd say this team would win 20-17. They accepted that, but they wouldn't allow him to use the word point spread. Now the NFL is in bed with all the gambling companies, Las Vegas. They're making money off gambling. Things have really changed, haven't they, Duncan?
They most certainly have. 10 years or so ago, the city of Las Vegas wanted to put on a tourism commercial during the Super Bowl, and the NFL told the network, whichever network was broadcasting that year, they would not allow that. And now fast forward 10, 12 years, and like you said, not only are we playing it in Las Vegas, where there's a team in Las Vegas, but they have sponsors that are heavily involved in betting issues. So yeah, it's changed quite a lot over the years.
So we're just going to dovetail from that because what caused that was a Supreme Court decision which allowed states to just about every state that wants to, including Indiana, to have legal sports betting. You and I remember sports betting was something you did, some in certain establishments around the city, and you just knew who to talk to place a wager on a game. Well, now you go and do it legally, which is just an amazing. And it was the Supreme Court decision that laid that out, and that was when the sports leagues say, "Okay, we give up. We're just going to make money off it too." So Supreme Court. We're going to move from that Supreme Court decision to another one as we get into our subjects for today, because, government shutdowns have been a very big issue with every federal employee. NTEU really has gone to the mat legally to try to get help for federal employees that are impacted by government shutdowns. That 35-day shutdown we had during the Trump administration put a lot of federal employees in financial trouble. Well, NTEU did petition the Supreme Court on a very important case dealing with a government shutdown. So I'm going to let you know allow you to talk to our audience about what happened in this case and how NTEU really did go to the mat legally to try to represent people working for the federal government.
Yeah, this is one that dealt with the 2018 into 2019 35-day shutdown, which was devastating plain, pure, and simple for so many of our members here in Indiana, across the country, and federal workers, period. And what NTU had done is said, we understand that they're getting the back wages, but that didn't help them during the time period when it was going on. You can't, it was tough to tell your mortgage company or the bank that held your note on your car or buying groceries, hey, we're going to get to you at the end of this. So NTU filed a suit and basically said, we're seeking compensatory damages for this, for the folks who were directly impacted and had to work and wait for a paycheck. And, they had a lower court victory that, of course, the government appealed. And the appellate court said, nope, they should not receive any damages. And so this has gone through the court proceedings until NTU took it to the Supreme Court, all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, no, we're not dealing with this. They are not getting any compensatory damages. So, no, we didn't win this, but it is a great example to show that NTU is in there swinging at all times for the federal employees that we represent.
Yeah, when you're dealing with legal issues, you win some, you lose some. And this was just a great example of how the NTEU legal staff looked at every possible option, even petitioning the United States Supreme Court to hear the case. Supreme Court takes only a small percentage of the cases presented to them. So we didn't have a really great chance, but you never know until you try. The way it works in the Supreme Court, it takes 4 justices to want to hear a case, and there weren't 4 justices willing to hear this case. So once again, NTEU did everything possible. We still think that federal employees who are impacted by government shutdowns should be allowed some kind of damages. We've not been able to get that done through the court system. We have, though, been able to do that one thing, Duncan, and I want to remind people of this. When shutdowns got to be a big thing in the 1990s, started in the 80s, but in the 1990s, when we started having longer shutdowns, people forget that when we would have a shutdown, there was no guarantee that federal employees would be paid during the shutdown period. And NTEU did was instrumental in getting a law passed where now, if there are shutdowns, at least federal employees are guaranteed to be paid once the shutdown's over. It's not the best solution, but at least we have that guarantee in the law.
Yeah, and it was always a nail biter before that law was passed. You were pretty sure that you were going to get paid for any days that were missed through no fault of your own through a shutdown, but there wasn't any guarantee of that. And you had to wait for Congress to vote on. And that, there were a couple of them that were a little bit nail biters. But once we, had this situation, they said, okay, we're going to just make it a law that federal government employees will not be harmed overall. They're still going to be harmed in the short run, but not overall. We'll make sure that they are made whole for any work they missed during a government shutdown when Congress is not able to come up with a budget or a continuing resolution. So, yeah, that's something that NTU pushed very, very hard for, worked with our folks on Capitol Hill, and we're able to get that passed. And I'm very grateful for that.
So again, NTEU will go to the mat legally every time there's an issue dealing with the people who are members of this union, and will continue to do so. Speaking of government shutdowns, here we go again. We have another continuing resolution. It's 2-tiered. The IRS deadline will be March the 8th, which is a little less than a month from now. So we may get a clue when the first deadline hits as to whether or not the Congress is serious about getting a budget for the fiscal year done. We're several months into the fiscal year already, don't have a budget, which means that still hamstrings agencies like IRS and many others. IRS going into a tax season where, overtime is needed for toll-free and other operations that are needed, and it may be very difficult for the service to be able to provide that with the uncertain funding on the horizon. So, Duncan, is there any hope? I mean, Congress does seem to be showing less signs of dysfunction as far as getting things done and other issues. So how does this dysfunction and other issues foresee or foreshadow what might happen in the budget talks that are still going on?
It doesn't leave you with a great deal of hope. I mean, when you see some of the things that have happened in Congress over the last week that should have at least been a passed vote, not necessarily for good reasons, but a passed vote, and surprise, surprise, they couldn't get that done. It really makes you wonder where so many moving parts, like a budget, and they've all said that they want to do regular appropriations. They want to do it through 12 appropriations bill instead of what's called an omnibus, where they just pile everything together, have a top line figure, and have got it all in this one bill. They don't want to do it that way. Well, unfortunately, it's not moving through the regular appropriations. Shocker. And with Congress getting ready to, the House and the Senate at a little bit different times, but they're both getting ready to take 2-week recesses for the President's Day holiday. Now, I don't know, maybe it's me. I always thought President's Day was one day, unless you're a mattress sale in which it's extended. But aside from that, I always thought it was one day, and yet they're taking a 2-week recess to go back and be in their districts and things of that nature. But that leaves precious little time for them to come to an agreement on funding. And with as fractious as the Congress has been lately, the last several decades, I don't know what's going to happen. We've been told before that there's not going to be any more continuing resolutions coming out of the House. The other thing that plays into this is I believe it's coming up in April. If there's not a budget bill passed by that, there are going to be automatic spending cuts for every single government agency, including defense. And nobody wants to see that. So they're trying to work with that deadline as well. So there are a lot of things going on that have to happen here to get this taken care of. And I hope for the best and plan for the worst, but I'm just not sure that Congress is going to be able to get it done on time.
And I want to say this not in a partisan way at all, but it seems that we have a rookie Speaker of the House, and he put a floor vote on the floor, and it didn't pass by like what, 2 or 3, 4 votes, something like that. And the one party in majority has a very small majority, so you have to be very careful about counting votes. Past speakers at least were able to count the votes and know whether they can pass it or not. So when you put something on the floor and you want it passed and it doesn't pass, that doesn't show that the leadership is very good at just doing the basic counting of votes. So I'm worried that even if an agreement is reached and we're not there yet on budgets, that it can even be implemented. So there's a lot of moving parts in this. I'm a little concerned, but I think that gun to the head of Congress, where everything would be cut pell-mell if nothing happens, I think you're right, it's sometime in April, will scare those people in Congress, and everybody's favorite projects would be cut. That's the one thing that will get Congress moving. So I'm hopeful on that front. But your point is well taken. We've talked about this on previous podcasts. So we will continue to watch this. There's only one thing that may be positive in all this, Duncan. Even though the senators and members of Congress are going to take a 2-week recess, their staff will continue to work. Maybe, just maybe, the staff members can work up some options where they can have something to work with when they get back. Just a possibility, piece of hope. You never know.
Yeah, and like you said, that is the ray of hope. Unfortunately, it seems like there's a lot of other things in front of the budget that they're trying to work on before they may even get to the budget. And I'm scared to death that by the time those get finished and fixed, there's not going to be any time for the budget. But yeah, you're absolutely right. While the folks in Congress take the time off, the staffers are going to be behind, hopefully working on this and everything else to try and get things moving through the House and the Senate.
Move on to something else, because we've talked occasionally about contract provisions. And Duncan, you've been very involved in the national agreement and other side agreements that have been reached between NTEU and IRS that continue to govern the workplace at the Internal Revenue Service. And I think one of the most important gains, and this happened way back when I was a union official, was the right for an employee to do a self-assessment. And I don't know that every employee takes advantage of this. There's some very strong contract language in it, but there are some time periods you need to understand, and there are some tricks of the trade you need to know. So if you're looking to improve your annual appraisal, self-assessment is a great way to do that. Your manager doesn't always know everything that you do. You do know that. So give us a primer, a kind of a redo, if you will, just how the self-assessment section of the contract works and how it can certainly positively impact an employee who uses that.
Yeah, that's one of those things that, as you said, it's been in the contract quite a while. It's a great tool. You get time on the clock to do a self-assessment, and you do that during your last month of your rating period. If you need to figure out when your rating period ends, you can take a look to see when your previous rating period ends, or go in to the contract and take a look at the index, and it's based on the last digit of your social security number. But during that last month of your rating period, not when it's over, but during that last month, you want to contact your manager and say, hey, I'd like time to do a self-assessment. And there are self-assessment tools out there that can help you do this. Because as you said, Larry, nobody knows, the work that you do more than you do. Nobody knows the good things you're doing more than you do. Your manager will have a good idea, or should have a good idea, of the work that you're doing. Sometimes I'm astounded at managers that come up with appraisals that don't seem to realize what employee they're having, but that's another story. But the vast majority of managers will try and do a good job with the documentation that they have. But there may be other things that they don't realize that you're doing during the year, and only you can tell them, and the self-assessment is a great way to do this. The other part of this is when they are doing your appraisal, they have to take that self-assessment into consideration. Now, if you're saying, I'm wonderful, I should get all fives, and your documentation doesn't show that, documentation shows that you failed at weren't consistent in many things, or possibly even failed, that's going to be a tough road to hoe. But if you've gotten good, consistent ratings in something, every time that they do an EQ or something equivalent to that, it shows that you did something that's consistent. And you want to make sure that that's noticed by your manager. And the self-assessment is the best tool to be able to do that, to help yourself.
I do know that when I was a manager, I always loved it when I received a self-assessment, because I always read them carefully, and I always took that into consideration with any appraisal I did for an employee. And I will say I had some very good managers that when I did my self-assessment, I could even see in the narrative that they would quote from my self-assessment, and that they did take that into consideration when doing my appraisal. So managers are required to do that. And if you do a self-assessment, you do document, as you said, items that maybe have not been documented by your manager in that appraisal file. Talk to your local chapter. In Indiana, talk to Duncan or any of his stewards or officials. And wherever you may be at IRS, talk to your local chapter if you don't think your self-assessment was considered at all, because that is a requirement in the contract. And we can file a grievance saying, hey, manager, you are supposed to consider this. You didn't take it into consideration at all. But you do have to do the self-assessment the correct way. So if you're an employee, Duncan, and you're saying, I want to do a self-assessment, how do I know the time frame? How do I know how to write one? I'm new at this. I work in toll-free. It's hard to get the time off to do it. Some pointers for people who may need to know some details.
Yeah, well, it doesn't matter what division you're in. Management is required to give you time on the clock during your last month of the rating period. Now, they may split it up a little bit. okay, an hour here, an hour here, and an hour here just because of workload demands, but they still have to give you time to do it. As to how to do it, if you just put in on the IRS homepage in the search box, you just put in self-assessment tutorial. There's going to be a couple of them that are going to come up, and a couple of them are very good at explaining exactly how you should do it, what format, and doesn't matter what division you're in. The basic premise is going to be the same for all of them. You take a look. Hopefully, you have your documentation you received during the year from your EQs or any other documentation your management's given you on your work, and take a look at those, and then base your self-assessment off of those. And these tutorials will also tell you how best to take a look at your documentation and put it into your self-assessment. So the information's all out there for you. And, if you have a manager saying, well, it's really tough right now, I understand when your appraisals due, but we're not going to give you time to do a self-assessment. That's when you need to reach out to chapter stewards or officials and let us know, in Indiana or across the country, let your chapter know, so they can contact that manager and say, okay, I'm not sure what you're thinking, but yeah, I understand you might have a big workload, but you don't have a choice. You need to give them the time to do this self-assessment.
And there have been times when someone is kind of lost. They want to do it. They're not sure. I have actually taken union time to just get them. So I can't write it for you, as a union official. I can't write your self-assessment, but I can certainly point people in the right direction, and I can give them pointers on how to get started. So any chapter official would be happy to do that. That is a representational kind of activity, correct?
Yeah, and like I said, basically what we'd be doing is pointing you towards those tutorials, because yeah, 12 years ago, there wasn't much information out there on it, and now there is plenty of it out there on the IR web to be able to explain what you need to do and how to get it started and go forward with it.
Yeah, and the old IR web has lots of tools there. Just learn how to use that. Let's move on to another issue. Let's talk about retirement. One thing that you always hear when retirement comes up is, okay, you want to make sure you have your high three, which is your high 3 years of earnings you'll be basing your retirement on those high 3 years of earnings. But that's a little bit of a misnomer, Duncan. I know you want to kind of dig down deep into some details. It's really not your high three, it's something else entirely. Talk about what you mean.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where, now having joined the 10% club, so to speak, when I'm ready to retire, which is not yet. Um, you hear people say, well, it's based on your high three salary. So people are saying, okay, well, I just got this big bump in January, so now my salary's higher and I can include that. Not exactly. And where you talk about the misnomer is, it's not really a high three, it's your high 36 months, your high consecutive 36 months. So, if somebody said, well, I'm going to retire in June of this year, and these have been my highest 3 years of salary. And so they might say, well, that would be my 24, my 23, and my 22 salaries. No. And the reason for that is it's not high three, it's high 36. So it'd be half of your 24, your 23 salary, your 22 salary, and half of your 21 salary, that other 6 months to make up the 36 months. So you want to make sure that when you're looking at retiring, you're factoring that in to get an accurate picture. Because I was talking to people, and I have a lot of people talk to me about how to do retirement calculations and things of that nature. And this is something that a lot of people miss, that I want to make sure that it's clearly understood. It's your high 36 consecutive months. For most people, it's the end of their career. Now, they may have been a manager and gone back to a downgrade to a lesser grade as a bargaining unit employee, and the management pay was their high threes. So you have to take a look at that. But it's your high 36 consecutive months to get your high three figure. And I just want to make sure that that's clear for everyone.
I think that is well known, and you're right. Most people, it's the last 36 months of your career, but there are people who go to management and say, "Well, it's not really for me. I need to step down." So your high 36 might have been earlier in your career. Either way, it's the highest amount that will you'll be basing your retirement on. There's not that many people left with CSRS that I'm under. Most people are under FERS now, so. That's be familiar with it. They used to, Duncan, I know that, and this may not be around anymore. Let me just ask you about this. At one time, when I was working for IRS eons ago, 12, 13 years ago, there was an IR website where you could sort of get an estimate of what your retirement would be. Is that still around?
That the GRB platform is what's used now for retirement issues, and that will give you a decent idea. It may not be exact, and it also used to be where you could contact, um, the specialists that work on retirement and say, "Hey, I'd like to get an estimate." They give very few estimates now, not because they want to be mean, not because they're evil. It's just because they don't have the manpower to do it. They're too busy concentrating on actual retirement paperwork to even give estimates. I had one where they shot me something saying, "Well, it looks like you had temporary work at the start of your career." No, I was not temporary. I was seasonal. And that makes a huge difference
It does. Yeah.
in things for figuring out uh, how much your retirement's going to be. So these are all things that you need to think about and be preparing for before you put in your paperwork to retire. So just a general awareness for folks.
Yeah, I started off as a temp eons ago when I started with the federal government before I got full-time employment, and that is a whole different set of circumstances, and seasonal is yet another set of circumstances. So there is a big difference there. And if the record's not correct, you do want to make sure that gets corrected. Speaking of retirement again, and speaking of the workload you talked about, there always seems to be a flood of retirements at the end of the calendar year. And 2023 was no exception. We talked a lot at the end of last year about how OPM is catching up and starting to process retirements more timely. Well, guess what? That influx of retirements came in at the end of 2023. And the latest data that we have shows that Office of Personnel Management, OPM, or the HR department for the whole federal government, which processes retirement applications, they now have retirement backlogs up 46%. So if you retired at the end of last year and you're listening to this podcast or thinking of retiring soon, be aware it may take a little longer, well, maybe a lot longer, because of that end of the year influx, which, they know it's coming, but they still only have so many people to do this work.
Yeah, and like you said, it happens almost every year. OPM has been gearing up and hiring more employees, but they just get hit with this tsunami because December 31st is especially for FERS employees, of which I think it's like 94% of federal employees are now FERS employees as opposed to civil service CSRS. Um, that they know it's coming. It's sort of like tax season for folks who are in the tax or in the phones. All the employees know it's coming, but sometimes it seems that upper level managers get surprised by this. Oh wait, it's filing season and we're getting hit with a bunch of people. Yes, that happens every year. Um so OPM, to their credit, is trying, but it's going to be a catch up. Eventually we'll get to a more electronic, and that's part of the problem too. It's a lot of these are still paper files that we're dealing with. The sooner we can get to do all electronic, and I think that's where IRS is trying to do with their submissions with this GRB platform, is to try and eliminate some of those mistakes that happen, and that's what usually causes. It's not just manpower, but the causes the lengthy delays. If there's any sort of errors, or if you've worked for multi different agencies, had a break in service, things of that nature, these are all things that can increase the time it takes to do that, as well as the actual number of retirements being put in.
Have one last comment I would like to make, and Duncan, you're welcome to chime in on this as well. Duncan often sends out links to those who ask in an email when we have our both our video and audio versions of our podcast. Once it's available, he lets people know. There have been some instances where people have not been able to access our podcast. Well, here's the problem. If you're using the IRS internet system, the IRS has the right to block it if they choose to do so. And I don't know what the code of conduct is anymore, if we're even supposed to listen to video and streaming audio, but that's what you're doing if you're using the IRS system. You can watch our podcast on YouTube or listen to it on SoundCloud or various other platforms. This podcast is not just on SoundCloud, which is where I house them originally, so it's where it's on originally. But I'm on lots of other podcast platforms like iTunes and SoundCloud and Spotify and a whole long list of them. But it takes a little time for that RSS feed to get on there, so it usually takes several hours before it's on all the different platforms. But we would recommend, Duncan, that you not use the IRS internet system to watch or listen to our podcast. Just take that link and use your cell phone or your internet connection at home or whatever when you're not working to listen or watch the podcast. Would that be your advice as well?
Yeah, it was a little bit surprising last week when started getting a couple of messages back saying, "Hey, we can't get to the podcast." And I went and looked myself, and yes, IRS in their infinite wisdom has decided that SoundCloud, for whatever reason, is one of those banned sites. So, and it may be that that it's just taking up too much bandwidth or whatever the problem is. So what I suggested to folks, and I think it's just a good idea on a regular basis, is if you're interested in watching and listening to this podcast, which if you're still here by now, you are, and we appreciate it, transfer it over to your personal device, as Larry said. You watch it on your phone, on a tablet, on a laptop, something of that nature, and that way you don't have to worry about doing it on government time or with their restrictions on what they're allowing.
Okay, Duncan, time for your final comment.
My final comment is with all the money that my team has spent this year, I know the Super Bowl is coming up, but I'm ready for the pitchers and catchers to report, and I'm looking forward to either several World Series appearances or we made some really bad investments.
Duncan, that's really interesting because we don't talk about our final comments most of the time. I've got the final comment was exactly that about spring training coming up. Super Bowls, every time the Super Bowl comes up, it's just a few days after that. Now, my Reds, the pitchers and catchers report February 14th, just literally days after the Super Bowl's complete. And your Dodgers, I think, have the first exhibition game of the spring series. I think they're playing the Padres on February 22nd, so they're getting an early start. I think don't the Dodgers start the season in South Korea this year?
Yes, they do.
I thought
so.
So.
It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and they've got they've spent just a dime or two on players, have they not? The best team money can buy. So we'll see how it used to be the Yankees. Now it's the Dodgers that have spending the coin on the players. Well, we'll see. I mean, let's just hope both our teams are favored. The Reds are definitely not spending lots of dime on players, some, but not nearly what the Dodgers are. So let's just hope our teams have.
And we need to let our viewers and listeners know that we're no Johnny come latelys to our team. You've been a Reds fan forever. I've been a Dodgers fan since I was about 6 years old, since my best friend was a San Francisco Giants fan, and so I became a Dodgers fan. So this is not anything that has been a recent occurrence.
You've been listening to and watching the Chapter 49 podcast. You just heard Duncan Giles, our chapter president, and we talk about a lot of things on this podcast, mostly federal employee issues, but we just can't help ourselves. We do talk about sports every now and then, so we just talked about the Super Bowl and baseball all at one time. But we hope you enjoy the podcast. Again, if you like it, let people know, and we would appreciate you spreading the word. So we thank you very much for spending time with us on this podcast. And please Be safe and be kind.